The Hell of Mirrors. By Edogawa Rampo. You asked for an unusual story? Then how about this one?
Once, when 5 or 6 of us were taking turns telling frightening and curious tales, my friend Kay spoke last and began in this fashion. I never afterward asked whether it had really happened or was merely a story of Kay's invention, so I cannot tell you which it was. Perhaps it impressed me so strangely because I had already listened to so many uncanny accounts, or because the day itself, near the end of spring, was oppressively overcast, the air heavy and stagnant as water at the bottom of a deep pool, leaving storytellers and listeners alike in a vaguely unhinged mood. This was his story.
I have an unfortunate friend. Let us simply call him he. At some point, the strangest malady in the world took possession of him. It may have been inherited from some afflicted ancestor. That is not pure speculation. Either his grandfather or great-grandfather had embraced the forbidden Christian faith, and at the bottom of an old wicker trunk the family kept antiquated books in Western script, an image of the Virgin Mary, pictures of Christ upon the cross, and the like. In that same trunk were a century-old telescope of the sort seen in old illustrated travel games, an oddly shaped compass, and beautiful glass objects, what people in those days called diamond or vidro. From early childhood, he often had them brought out to play with. Looking back, even then he seems to have had a peculiar fondness for things that reflect or reproduce the appearance of objects, glass, lenses, and mirrors. His toys were almost exclusively a magic lantern, a spyglass, a magnifying glass, and similar devices, Masakato spectacles, a kaleidoscope, and prism toys that made people and objects appear long and narrow or broad and flat when held to the eye. I also remember an incident from his boyhood. One day I visited his study and found an old Polonia box on the desk. The object had probably come from it. He was holding an antique metal mirror in the sunlight and casting its reflected light onto a dark wall.
Well, isn't it interesting? Look over there. A mirror as flat as this produces a strange character when its light falls on that wall.
At his prompting I looked, and to my astonishment a brilliant, platinum-white character, meaning long life, appeared within a white circle, though its shape was somewhat distorted. How extraordinary! What makes it do that? To me as a child it seemed almost divine, at once fascinating and frightening, and the question escaped me before I knew it.
You can't guess, can you? Shall I reveal the trick? Once you know it, there's nothing to it. Here, look at the back of the mirror. See the character for long life in relief? It shows through to the front.
Sure enough, as he said, the back of the bronze-colored mirror bore a splendid raised design. But how could it pass through to the face of the mirror and cast such a pattern? Viewed from any angle, the front was perfectly smooth, it did not distort the face reflected in it. Yet the reflected light alone formed that mysterious image. It seemed like magic.
There is no magic in it at all.
Seeing my puzzled expression, he began to explain.
My father told me that, unlike glass mirrors, metal mirrors become cloudy and useless unless they are polished from time to time. This one has been in my family for generations, and has been polished countless times. Each polishing wears away the metal over the raised parts on the back, and over the thinner parts by infinitesimally different amounts. The thicker places resist the hand more than the thinner ones, you see. Those invisible differences in wear are remarkable. When the light is reflected, they appear as clearly as that. Do you understand?
His explanation gave me a reason of sorts, but the unknown fact behind it, the fact that a surface smooth enough to reflect an undistorted face could reveal distinct ridges and hollows when it reflected light, chilled me with something like the uneasiness one feels on peering through a microscope at the minute and unseen. The mirror was so strange that I remember it especially well, but it was only one example. His childhood games were filled almost entirely with things of that kind. Curiously enough, his influence affected me too, and to this day I retain more curiosity about lenses than most people. In boyhood, however, his interest had not yet gone so far. When he reached the upper years of middle school and began to study physics, which of course includes the theory of lenses and mirrors, he became utterly absorbed. From then on he changed into what one might call a lens fanatic, to a degree that deserved the name of illness. I remember one lesson on concave mirrors. A small specimen was passed among the students, and each boy looked at his own face in it. At the time my face was badly covered with pimples. I felt, somehow, that they were connected with sexual matters and was desperately ashamed of them. When I casually peered into the concave mirror, I cried out in spite of myself. Every pimple on my face had been magnified to a monstrous size, like the surface of the moon seen through a telescope. The tip of each pimple, now like a small hill, had burst open like a pomegranate, and blackish blood seeped from it with the lurid horror of a painted theater billboard depicting a murder scene. Perhaps my shame about my complexion made it worse, but the face in that concave mirror was so dreadful and grotesque that ever afterward, whenever I saw such a mirror, and they were commonly displayed at exhibitions and sideshows, I shuddered and fled from it. He, on the other hand, looked into the concave mirror that day and reacted in precisely the opposite way. Far from being frightened, he appeared captivated, and let out an exclamation, "Oh!" loud enough to ring through the entire classroom. It sounded so absurd that everyone burst out laughing. From that moment, however, concave mirrors became his obsession. He bought them in every size and, using wire, cardboard, and other materials, built intricate contraptions over which he would grin in private. His passion gave him a genuine gift for devising mechanisms no one else would have imagined. He even ordered books on conjuring from abroad. One device that still fills me with wonder, and startled me when I encountered it during another visit to his room, was a contraption called the magic banknotes. It was a square cardboard box about 2 feet on each side. In its front was an opening like the entrance to a building, and 5 or 6 1-yen notes stood there like postcards in a letter rack.
Try taking one of those notes.
He set the box before me and, with an innocent expression, told me to take a banknote. I did as he said, reached out, and tried to snatch one. Yet the note I could see as plainly as anything offered no resistance whatever to my hand. It was as insubstantial as smoke. I had never been so astonished. What? He watched my bewilderment and laughed with evident delight. Then he explained that the illusion had been invented by a British physicist, or perhaps it was someone from another country, and that its secret, once again, was a concave mirror. I no longer remember the precise theory. The real banknotes were laid flat at the bottom of the box, a concave mirror was set diagonally above them, and an electric lamp inside the box illuminated the notes. According to the laws governing the distance and angle at which an object beyond the focus of a concave mirror forms an image, the banknotes appeared neatly at the opening. An ordinary mirror could never make them look as though they were truly there, but a concave mirror, strangely enough, forms a real image. And those notes truly did appear to be standing there before one's eyes. Thus his abnormal fascination with lenses and mirrors only intensified. When he graduated from middle school, he made no attempt to continue his education. His parents were partly to blame for indulging him too much. They generally allowed their son to have his way, however unreasonable his wishes. Feeling himself a full-grown man as soon as he left school, he had a small laboratory built on an open patch of the garden and began pursuing his peculiar hobby there. Until then, school had placed some restraint upon his time, and his condition had not become too serious. Once he shut himself in the laboratory from morning until night, however, the illness began to advance with terrifying speed. He had never possessed many friends, but after graduation his entire world contracted to that narrow laboratory. He went nowhere for amusement, visitors gradually ceased to call, and apart from members of his household, I became the only person who still entered his room. My visits were infrequent even then, but each time I witnessed his sickness growing worse, until it had reached a state close to madness, and I could not suppress a private shudder. Then 2 further misfortunes aggravated his morbid tendency. His parents both died in an epidemic of influenza, leaving no one whose wishes he needed to respect and placing an enormous fortune at his disposal for whatever experiments he pleased. Moreover, after passing the age of 20, he began to take an interest in women. In a man whose tastes were already so perverse, desire assumed a profoundly abnormal form and joined itself to his mania for lenses, each passion feeding the other. The story I am about to tell concerns the incident that brought this process to a dreadful end. Before I describe it, however, I should give you 2 or 3 examples of how grave his condition had become. His house stood on high ground in the upper part of the city. The laboratory occupied a corner of its spacious garden from which he could look down upon the roofs of the streets below. His first project there was to shape the roof like an observatory, install a fairly powerful astronomical telescope, and immerse himself in the world of the stars. By then he had taught himself a respectable amount of astronomy. But so commonplace a pastime could never satisfy him. At the same time, he kept a high-powered telescope beside a window and trained it at various angles upon the open rooms of the houses below, secretly indulging in the sinful pleasure of spying upon their occupants. Those rooms might stand within board fences or face the backs of other houses, so their occupants believed themselves invisible from anywhere. Naturally, they never imagined that someone on a distant hill was observing them through a telescope. They therefore conducted every private activity without restraint, while to him it all appeared as nakedly as if it were taking place directly before his eyes.
This is the one pleasure I could never give up.
So he would say, regarding the telescope by the window as his supreme delight. When one thinks about it, the prank must indeed have been entertaining. He sometimes let me look as well, and now and then I unexpectedly discovered some curious sight at such close quarters that I could not help blushing. Among his other devices was what one might call a submarine telescope, the arrangement by which someone inside a submarine observes the surface. With it, while remaining in his own room, he could peer into the private quarters of the servants, especially the younger maids, without their suspecting a thing. At other times he used magnifying glasses and microscopes to observe the lives of minute organisms. One especially novel practice was his breeding of fleas. He made them crawl beneath a magnifying glass or a low-powered microscope, watched them suck his blood, and placed 2 together to see them fight if they were of the same sex or behave amicably if they were of opposite sexes. Most repulsive of all, he would half kill a flea and watch its agony enormously magnified. After looking once, I found those insects, toward which I had previously felt nothing in particular, strangely terrifying. The microscope magnified 50 times. Through it, a single flea filled the entire field of vision. Its mouth, the claws of its feet, and every tiny hair upon its body stood out distinctly, and, to use an odd comparison, it appeared as huge and fearsome as a wild boar. In a sea of black blood, a single drop appeared so vast, half its back crushed flat, it clawed at empty space, thrust out its proboscis as far as it could, and assumed the hideous aspect of death throes. One could almost imagine a terrible scream issuing from its mouth. There would be no end if I related every such detail, so I shall omit most of them. Yet the amusements with which he began his laboratory grew ever more extravagant as the months passed, and on one occasion this happened. I called on him one day and casually opened the laboratory door. For some reason the blinds had been lowered, leaving the room dim. Across the entire wall opposite, an area perhaps 6 feet square, something hazy seemed to writhe. Thinking it a trick of my eyes, I rubbed them, but the thing still moved. I remained in the doorway, holding my breath as I stared at the monster. Gradually the mist-like shape grew clearer. I saw a black thicket like a stand of planted needles, beneath it, gleaming eyes as large as wash-basins. The brownish irises and even the rivers of blood vessels in the whites appeared blurred yet uncannily distinct, like a soft-focus photograph. Then came nostrils like cavern mouths, glittering with hairs like palm trees, lips of a sickening scarlet, each seemingly as large as 2 cushions piled together, and between them, shining white teeth like roof tiles. In short, it was a human face filling the whole room, alive and writhing. The slow movement and the living color made it obvious that this was no motion picture. More than revulsion or terror, I felt that I myself must have lost my mind, and I cried out in astonishment. Then,
Did I startle you? It's me! It's me!
His voice came from another direction, making me jump. Yet exactly as the voice spoke, the monster's lips and tongue moved on the wall, and its basin-sized eyes narrowed into a grin.
Ha 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 ha! What do you think of this little arrangement?
The room suddenly brightened and he emerged from a dark chamber at one side. Needless to say, the monster on the wall vanished at the same instant. Most of you have probably guessed the explanation. It was a projection of a living subject. By means of mirrors, lenses, and an intense light, an actual object could be projected just as it was. The principle may be found in children's toys, but he had devised an apparatus of his own that enlarged the image to an extraordinary scale, and he had projected his own face through it. Once explained, it sounds like nothing, but the effect was thoroughly startling. Such things were characteristic of his taste. Another, similar device seemed even more mysterious. This time the room was not darkened, and I could see his face. He placed before it a strange apparatus crowded with mirrors, and one of his eyes, nothing but the eye, suddenly appeared in midair before me, again as large as a wash-basin. When he sprang it upon me without warning, I froze as if trapped in a nightmare and scarcely felt alive. Once the secret was disclosed, however, it proved to be the same principle as the magic banknotes I mentioned earlier. A number of concave mirrors had merely enlarged the image. Even knowing that it was theoretically possible, one had to consider the time and expense involved. No one else would have attempted so absurd a feat, and in that sense it might fairly be called his invention. After he showed me one such thing after another, I began to regard him almost as some terrifying supernatural creature. 2 or 3 months after those events, he conceived a new idea. He partitioned off a small portion of the laboratory and covered the ceiling, floor, and 4 walls with single sheets of mirror, creating what is commonly called a mirror room. Even the door was entirely mirrored. Carrying one candle, he would enter it alone and remain there for long periods. No one knew why he did such a thing, though it is possible to imagine what he saw. A person standing in the center of a chamber mirrored on all 6 sides must see every part of his body reproduced without end as mirror reflects mirror. Above, below, and on every side, countless people identical to himself must seem to swarm and press upon him. The thought alone is chilling. As a child, I had entered a crude mirror room attraction at the Yoda Labyrinth sideshow. Even that extremely imperfect imitation filled me with terror. Remembering it, I firmly refused when he once invited me into his mirror room. Before long, I learned that he did not always enter the mirror room alone. The other person was his favorite housemate and also his lover, a beautiful girl of 18. He often used to say,
"The one thing that distinguishes her is the countless deep, delicate shadows across her entire body. Her color is not bad, her skin is fine, and her flesh has the elastic fullness of a sea animal, but beyond all those qualities, her beauty lies in the depth of its shadows."
With that girl he played in his kingdom of mirrors. The mirrored room was a sealed compartment within the closed laboratory, so no one outside could observe them, but I heard rumors that they sometimes shut themselves in for more than an hour. He often went in alone as well. On one such occasion he remained there so long without making a sound that a servant, overcome with anxiety, knocked at the door. It flew open, and he emerged stark naked and alone. Without saying a word, he turned abruptly and walked toward the main house. From around that time, his health, which had never been robust, seemed to deteriorate day by day. Yet as his body weakened, his strange mania grew still more intense. At enormous expense he began collecting mirrors of every conceivable shape, flat, convex, concave, undulating, cylindrical. It was astonishing that so many varieties existed. The spacious laboratory became so crowded with distorted mirrors carried in each day that there was scarcely room for anything else. But even that was not enough. To everyone's amazement, he began building a glassworks in the middle of the large garden. It was designed to his own specifications and, for the special products he required, was unequaled in Japan. He selected the engineers and craftsmen with the greatest care and seemed ready to sacrifice every remaining penny of his fortune to the enterprise. Unfortunately, he had no relatives who might have advised him. Some servants, unable to remain silent, ventured a word of remonstrance, but anyone who did so was dismissed at once. Those who remained were a contemptible lot interested only in the outrageously high wages he paid. As his sole friend in heaven or on earth, I ought to have calmed him and stopped this reckless course. Of course I tried many times, but no argument could reach his deranged mind. Besides, he was committing no crime, the fortune was his to spend as he chose. There was no other way to bring him to reason. I could only watch in anguish as his wealth and his life wasted away from day to day. For that reason I began visiting his house fairly often, hoping at least to keep watch over his behavior. Inevitably, I witnessed the bewildering succession of sorceries within his laboratory, however much I wished to avert my eyes. It was truly a world of astonishing strangeness and fantasy. As his illness reached its height, perhaps his extraordinary genius too revealed itself without reserve. The visions shifted like pictures in a revolving lantern, each one belonging to no world we know, beautiful, sinister, and uncanny. What words could possibly describe all that I saw and heard in those days? He used mirrors purchased elsewhere and supplemented them with mirrors made in his own factory wherever ordinary products were insufficient or the shapes he wanted could not be obtained. Thus one fantasy after another became reality. At one moment only his head would float through the laboratory, or only his torso, or only his legs. Needless to say, this was merely the familiar conjurer's method of stretching an enormous flat mirror diagonally across a room, cutting openings in it, and thrusting the head or limbs through them. Yet the performer was no stage magician, but my pathologically earnest friend, and the spectacle could not help seeming abnormal. At another time the whole room became a flood of concave, convex, undulating, and cylindrical mirrors. In their midst he danced in frenzy. His image became immense or minute, long and narrow or broad and flat, twisted and bent. Sometimes it consisted only of a torso, sometimes one head hung beneath another, sometimes a face had 4 eyes, or the lips stretched infinitely upward and downward and then contracted again. The reflections repeated and crossed one another in such bewildering confusion that they seemed the vision of a madman. At still another time the entire room became a gigantic kaleidoscope. Within a triangular mirrored tube scores of feet long, revolving with a mechanical clatter, flowers of every color, enough to empty a florist's shop, formed an opium dream. A single petal appeared as large as a whole tatami mat, then multiplied into thousands and tens of thousands, into 5-colored rainbows and polar auroras that engulfed the spectator's world. Amid them his naked body danced like a giant apparition, its enormous pores resembling craters on the moon. There were innumerable other forms of dreadful magic, none less astonishing than these and some more so, beauties of a demonic realm that might have struck a human being blind or unconscious at the first glance. I lack the power to convey them, and even if I tried, how could you possibly believe me? After this state of frenzy had continued for some time, the lamentable catastrophe finally arrived. My dearest friend became genuinely insane. His behavior until then had hardly seemed sane, it is true, but even while staging those wild spectacles, he passed much of each day like an ordinary man. He read, drove his emaciated body to supervise and direct the glassworks, and, when he met me, discussed his old, mysterious aesthetic ideas without the least difficulty. How could anyone have foreseen so pitiless an end? Perhaps it was the work of the demon that had nested within him. Or perhaps it was the wrath of God against a man who had immersed himself too deeply in the beauty of the demonic world. One morning, a messenger from his house awakened me in great agitation.
Something terrible has happened. Madam asks that you come at once.
Something terrible? What is it?
We don't know, sir. Please, could you come as quickly as possible?
The messenger and I had both turned pale. After this breathless exchange, I rushed to his estate without even pausing to prepare myself. The trouble was, as always, in the laboratory. I burst inside and found several servants, including the housemaid who was now called Madam, standing rigid with astonishment and staring at a peculiar object. It resembled a circus performer's balancing ball, only one size larger. Its entire exterior was covered with cloth, and it rolled right and left across the broad, cleared laboratory as though it were alive. More disturbing still, from somewhere within it came a hissing moan like laughter, neither wholly animal nor wholly human. What in the world has happened? There was nothing I could do but seize the former housemaid and ask her.
I haven't the slightest idea. I think the master may be inside, but none of us knew such an enormous ball even existed. And it's so dreadful that we cannot bring ourselves to touch it. We've called to him again and again, but nothing comes back from inside except that strange laughter.
At her answer, I went straight to the ball and searched for the point from which the sound escaped. I soon found 2 or 3 small holes in its rolling surface, apparently meant for ventilation. Fearfully, I placed an eye to one and peered inside. A strange, dazzling light glittered there, but I could make out nothing else beyond the sense of a human body moving and that eerie, deranged laughter. I called his name through the opening 2 or 3 times, but whether the thing within was human or something else, it gave no intelligible response. After watching the rolling ball for a while, I noticed an odd square seam at one point on its surface. It appeared to be a door into the sphere. It rattled when pushed, but had no handle and could not be opened. On closer inspection I found a hole in the metalwork where a handle seemed to have been. Could the handle have somehow fallen off after a man entered, leaving the door impossible to open from either side? If so, he had been imprisoned in the ball throughout the night. I searched the room and, just as I expected, found a round metal fitting in one corner. It fit the opening precisely. Unfortunately, its stem had broken away, so inserting it now could not open the door. The strangest thing was that the imprisoned man did not call for help, but only laughed and laughed. Could it be? An idea struck me, and the blood drained from my face. There was no time left to think. The ball had to be smashed. Whatever else happened, the person inside had to be rescued. I ran to the factory, seized a sledgehammer, hurried back, and brought it down upon the ball with all my strength. To my astonishment, its interior proved to be made of thick glass. With a tremendous crash, it shattered into innumerable pieces. The person who crawled out was unmistakably my friend. What I had feared was true. But can a human face change so completely in the space of a single day? Until yesterday, though wasted, his features had possessed a tense, nervous severity that could be frightening at first glance. Now every muscle in his face sagged like that of a corpse. His hair had been clawed into disorder, his eyes were bloodshot yet unnaturally vacant, and his mouth hung slack as he laughed and laughed. It was a sight one could not bear to look at twice. Even the former housemaid, whom he had so favored, recoiled from him in terror. Needless to say, he had gone mad. But what had driven him mad? He did not seem the kind of man who would lose his reason merely because he had been trapped inside a ball. More fundamentally, what was that grotesque sphere for, and why had he entered it? No one present had known of its existence, so he had presumably ordered the factory to construct it in secret. But what, in heaven's name, had he intended to do with that enormous glass ball? He wandered around the room, laughing without pause. The woman finally recovered enough to clutch his sleeve in tears. Into this scene of extraordinary agitation there happened to walk an engineer arriving for work at the glass factory. I seized him and fired questions in rapid succession, heedless of his bewilderment. Stripped of his stammering, his answers amounted to this. Some time earlier, he had been ordered to make a hollow glass sphere about 4 feet in diameter, with walls roughly 3/8 of an inch thick. The work had been conducted in secret and hurried forward until the sphere was finally completed late the previous night. The engineers naturally had no idea of its purpose. They had simply obeyed a series of strange instructions: coat the outside with mercury so that the entire inner surface became a mirror, install several small, powerful electric lamps inside, and fit one section of the sphere with a door large enough for a person to enter. When it was finished, they carried it into the laboratory during the night, connected the lamp's cord to the room's electrical wiring, delivered it to their master, and went home. The engineer knew nothing more. I sent the engineer away and entrusted the madman to the servants. Then, staring at the fragments of the strange glass sphere scattered around me, I tormented myself in an effort to solve the mystery of what had happened. For a long time I confronted those shards in silence. At last a thought occurred to me. Having tried and exhausted every arrangement of mirrors within the reach of his intelligence, had he devised this glass sphere as the final experiment? Had he entered it himself to gaze upon whatever extraordinary image it would produce? But why had he been driven mad? More important, what had he seen inside the sphere? What, in all the world, had he seen? The instant my thoughts reached that point, I felt as though a rod of ice had pierced the center of my spine, and the unearthly terror chilled me to the heart. Had he entered the glass sphere, caught one glimpse of his own image in the glare of the little lamps, and gone mad? Or, trying to escape, had he accidentally broken the door handle, then lost his reason after struggling in mortal agony within the cramped sphere, unable to get out? It must have been one or the other. But what could have terrified him so utterly? That lies beyond the limits of human imagination. Has any person before him ever stood at the center of a spherical mirror? Even a physicist could hardly calculate what image would appear upon its curved wall. Might it not have been a realm beyond humanity, a realm of terror and trembling that we are not even permitted to dream of? Might it not have been the most dreadful world of demons? There, perhaps, his form was not reflected as himself at all, but as something else, something whose aspect we cannot imagine, yet which filled his entire horizon, his entire universe, and could not fail to drive a human being mad. All we can do is extend to a sphere the terror of the concave mirror, which forms one portion of such a surface. You surely know the horror of a concave mirror, that nightmare world in which one seems to examine one's own body under a microscope. A spherical mirror is an endless succession of concave mirrors enclosing the whole body. For that reason alone, its terror must be many times, scores of times, greater than that of a single concave mirror. Does not the mere thought make our hair stand on end? It is a miniature universe enclosed by concave mirrors, not our world, but another one altogether, surely a country of madness. Thus my unfortunate friend sought the utmost limit of his mania for lenses and mirrors. He tried to reach a place that must never be reached, and whether he incurred the wrath of God or yielded to the temptation of the devil, in the end he could only bring about his own destruction. He later died without recovering his reason, so there is no means by which the truth can be established. Yet I, at least, have never been able to abandon the belief that he destroyed himself because he dared to invade the interior of that mirrored sphere.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.